I'm going to take the subject of summertime blues or blues and talk about sad poetry, really more despondent poetry, and I want to use it as a test case for what lyric poetry can do itself. I want to use this as an example of what I think is involved in the writing and the reading of poetry. When I was coming over here tonight, I had a poem by Robert Frost in my head that I could not get out, and it's a kind of contrast poem because it's a desolate poem, but it's a winter poem, and I think it'll help set the difference between the poetry of summer and the poetry of winter. It's called Desert Places. Snow falling and night falling fast, oh fast, in a field I looked into going past, and the ground almost covered smooth with leaves, but a few weeds and stubble showing last. The woods around it have it, it is theirs. All animals are smothered in their lairs. I am too absent spirited to count. The loneliness includes me unawares. And lonely as it is, that loneliness will be more lonely ere it will be less. A blanker whiteness of benighted snow with no expression, nothing to express. They cannot scare me with their empty spaces between stars, on stars where no human race is. I have it in me so much nearer home to scare myself with my own desert places. That's just a hell of a poem. There's a little bit of tough guy in it. That is, they cannot scare me with their empty spaces between stars. And then a funny rhyme, a playful rhyme, on stars where no human race is. I have it in me so much nearer home to scare myself with my own desert places. Now that's a winter poem. The thing about Frost in this poem is he has a kind of, I would call it, inner muteness. And the inner muteness is matched by the bleakness outside. That is, the blanker whiteness of benighted snow somehow becomes the external correlative of a desert place that's inside of himself. The difficulty with summer, as the opposite of this, is the tremendous gap between moments of inner despondency and the plenitude of summer. The poetry of summer is the poetry of richness, the poetry of fullness. Summer, I like summer too. It's a much better time. But when you are despondent in summer, you find it harder to find the season matching your feeling. Now, that's why the poetry of despondency often turns to winter. The reason that despondent poetry means so much to me is because people have taken their darkest inner feelings and transformed them into something that has been made. When a great poet of mental illness named John Clear writes, I am, yet what I am none cares or knows. My friends forsake me like a memory lost. I am the self-consumer of my woes. When he writes this, the fact that he would make it rhyme, the fact that he would turn it into an iambic pentameter line, the fact that he would shape it suggests that no matter how desolate he feels, he still has this urgent need to communicate with someone else. Not the people around him necessarily, but some future reader. I think lyric poetry presupposes a readership because language is social. It's the very nature of language to belong to not one person, but to any person. And when the feelings of inner muteness and desolation, which we're all overcome by, find a language in poetry, then that suggests that there is not a complete muteness, it's not total despair, because it suggests some contact with some future reader. Now, the first time I began to feel this strongly was when I was in college and I was trying to write poems, and I hadn't heard of anything. And so when anyone suggested a poet, I would go and read him, which I highly recommend to you. If you do that for 50 years, you do learn something. And someone had mentioned Gerard Manley Hopkins. I hadn't heard of him. And I went and found a poem of his. I got a book of his, and I read a poem, one of the so-called terrible sonnets. And one of them begins like this. I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day. What hours, oh, what black hours we have spent this night. What sights you, heart saw, ways you went, and more must in yet longer lights delay. With witness I speak this. For I say hours, I mean years, mean life. And my lament is cries countless, cries like dead letters sent to dearest him who lives, alas, away. I am gall, I am heartburn. It goes on like this. I wish I could tell you what that did to me. Emily Dickinson says, when you read a great poem, you feel as if the top of your head were taken off. That's how I felt. I recognized something in Hopkins that no one had ever said to me, some inner desolation that I had felt but couldn't name. And when Hopkins gave a name to it, I felt recognized. Instead of feeling more lonely, I felt less lonely. And I began to look at this poem. And then I said, well, holy shit, this thing is a sonnet. He's not actually just writing his poems out the way I'm writing mine. He's actually making it into a sonnet. It couldn't have just come to him like that. And over time, this story of my experience with Gerard Manley Hopkins became a model to me for what I'd call lyric exchange. That is, Hopkins had taken his despair. I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day. He wakes up in the middle of the night. It's not morning yet. What hours, what black hours we have spent this night. What ways you, heart, he addresses his heart. Ways you went and more must, and yet longer lights delay. Then it's as if he raises his hand. With witness I speak this. But where I say hours, I mean years. He's allegorizing, mean life. And my lament is cries countless, cries like dead letters sent to dearest him who lives, alas, away. Those letters to God, he was an Anglican priest. Those letters to God who will never hear them. Now, the reason this typifies lyric exchange for me is because here I was, a Jewish kid from Chicago in his dorm room in 1968, and I'm reading a poem by an Anglican priest from the 1860s, and this poem speaks more deeply to me than anything that anyone has ever said to me. And I began to feel the power of what lyric poetry can do. And I felt the generosity of what Gerard Manley Hopkins had done. Instead of just noting his despair down in a diary or keeping it to himself, he tried to shape it into something. And that shaping it into something made him a maker. And that making was to leave something behind of what he'd felt, so that later someone like me or you could come along and read this poem and feel something of what he'd felt, and therefore felt what we'd felt. Now, when you're alone reading a poem, you're not just alone with your own feelings. You are alone with the words of another. Now, I believe that poetry delivers on our spiritual lives precisely because it gives us the gift of privacy and participation. It gives us interiority, but it also gives us communication with another. And that puts us in relationship. It puts us in relationship to another. That's why for lyric poetry, I like Martin Buber's idea, in the beginning is the relation, instead of in the beginning was the word. The relation precedes the word because it's authored by the human. Now, I just want to say parenthetically, I've just turned the reading of poetry into a Jewish activity. just saying. Didn't want it to go by. Now, I like the poetry of individuality, where the lyric I speaks to some future person, as a message been sent in a bottle. Later, I came across the blues themselves. Now, one of the things that's really striking about the blues historically is that the blues as a form, almost certainly the sort of classic 12-bar blues that goes A, B, almost certainly came out of slave songs, field hollers, work songs with a kind of a call and response that was so characteristic of West African music. And so someone in the field would say something, and then someone would respond, often with a few words, and then it would go back and forth like that. Now, what the blues do is they take the call and response, and this is why it becomes an American form, not an African form, because of the kind of individuality. In the blues, which is sort of the classic blues, is A, B, where the first line, you say a line, then you repeat it, and then you have a second line. In the classic blues like that, the singer plays both roles, the call and the response. So I'm going down to the river, take my rocking chair. I'm going down to the river, take my rocking chair. If the blues come and get me, I'm going to rock on out of here. That singer has internalized the call and response to himself. Now, the form of it has a turn. And the turn is almost like what in the Italian sonnet is called the volta. It's a kind of, it gives you a line, and it gives you another line, then the line turns. And it's that turn where you get your lyric bite. Now, the blues are the music and the lyrics of individuals as opposed to, say, the spiritual, which is a communal form, which is a we. What's striking, which I hadn't really understood until I began to really study the blues more in my late 20s, was that this lyric I, this devil's music as an alternative to the spiritual music, this devil's music could not only reflect the feeling of some lone guitar singer, but the feelings, the interiority, the lonesomeness of an entire people. That by singing these songs and by passing the songs along, by taking a form that you'd inherited, by transforming that form, and by putting your stamp on it, your own mark of loneliness, other people could feel that same loneliness. Now, what oral poetry gives you, what the blues give you, is a kind of presence. You're in a kind of community. What it doesn't give you to the same extent is a kind of interiority, because you can't stop and think in oral poetry. You're with the flow. When Homer was singing his song and the audience was listening, they couldn't say, hey, that's a great simile, let's stop and think it over. The song is going by you. But when Sappho writes a lyric poem and you read it on the page and she goes, Eros the bittersweet, she takes the word bitter and she takes the word sweet and she puts them together for the first time and calls it a form of love, you can think about that and recognize for the first time there's a feeling that we now all recognize, the bittersweetness of love. Now, that's a feature of written poetry. And the reason that written poetry means so much to me is because it articulates states that we feel but do not name, that we feel but do not understand. It gives us a language for our own subjectivity, our own interiority. It gives us a way to be in the world. So, thank you.